right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mainely Hoops podcast. If you're enjoying our content, please make sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate all the support. But we're going to dive into week 3 here, starting off with the best game of the week, in your opinion. Marcus, let's start with you here.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to go with the game that was in Chicago on Wednesday night, and that's Alabama and Illinois. Alabama, of course, up to this point they've played 4 games, and 3 of them are against top 10 teams in Purdue, St. John's, and Illinois last week. They've won 2 of them. They've got another top 15 team on Monday against Gonzaga. But this game was really intriguing. Obviously, like heading into it, we did the game preview. We felt like there were a lot of avenues for Illinois to win this game. It just really stacked up as a pretty poor matchup for Alabama. But ultimately, like their shot making and LeBaron Philon kind of won out, right? He was fantastic. He had 24 points in this game. As crazy as it is, we talked about Aiden Sherrill and the weaker front court of Alabama, and Sherrill played 9 minutes and had 4 fouls. Like, he was completely a non-factor in this game, and Alabama still found a way to pull it out. So, for me, it was more about just Alabama's ability to now win 2 pretty big games here early in the season. Tough schedule, playing an Illinois team that really on all levels was kind of a bad matchup. And they still found a way to do it, put it up 90 points on this Illinois team. Obviously, we knew they were going to be comfortable against this Illinois defense that doesn't really turn you over. But, they kind of had their way and got enough stops, obviously, to pull this one out by 4.
Cody, what about you? What's your game of the week this week?
Yeah, just to touch on that game a little bit, that was just an awesome game in general. And it was really the Keaton Bristow coming out party in the front court. He played 20 minutes and he brought a lot of different dimensions to the table that like a Nate Oates big typically doesn't bring. Bama was like switching at all 5 spots down the stretch in that game and really put Illinois' pick and roll offense in it basically just took it away and forced them to be an isolation based offense. And those bigs, when they were switched on to guards in Bristow and Taylor Bull-Bowen and even Amari Allen was like awesome defending in space. So that was really the difference in that game. It kind of changed my opinion on what this Bama defense can be for the whole season. You kind of view them as just a team that's going to play their base drop coverage for the entire season. But obviously this is a roster that probably can't do that. And that the fact that Nate Oates is willing to change some things up on the defensive end, I know he's very analytically minded, but he had to send 2 to the ball very often, at least through the post. And I thought he did a phenomenal job there. Illinois is going to be okay. It was just, I think they were just a little bit confused on what they needed to do offensively down the stretch, just because that wasn't really in the game plan from a Nate Oates defense. So yeah, I thought Alabama did a really good job making adjustments on the fly. But for my game of the week, I'll go with Arizona and UConn. I just thought the atmosphere there, having to go on the road for Arizona in Stores to play a true road game. I wish all of these games were played in someone's home arena, like that Alabama-Illinois game getting played on an NBA court with like nobody's like college logos on the floor, like they're just playing on the Bulls floor. Just like it's a different atmosphere, and I really do like when it's played on a team's home floor. But this was a game that we obviously expected UConn to get the job done, barring that they were going to be at full strength, and Taurus Reed wasn't able to go in this game. And I thought it was a really big difference maker, obviously. And I thought, Eric Ribo held his own. He played 28 minutes, had 15 points, 4 rebounds, but they didn't really have a second big to contain this Arizona front court depth. Honestly, like Koa Pete had a solid game, was on the floor for 37 minutes. Toby Awaka, he got into some foul trouble, but and then Mo Krivas, getting 14 rebounds in this game was a really big difference. He was a really big difference on both ends of the floor as a rim deterrent, as an offensive rebounder. But yeah, Arizona's they've gone through the gauntlet early in the season. I think it's 3 top 15 wins now this season. So been very impressive for them. And to go all the way across the country, go on the road and stores to get the win there was pretty big. And then again, Jaden Bradley was awesome again. He's really made the leap as finally being a primary guard on a team. He's always kind of been the second guard on a team. Like, he was behind Caleb Love for a couple of years, but now he finally has his own backcourt, which I think suits him a little bit better. As a more of a non-shooter, having the ball in his hands a little bit more, I think he's more suited for success, and he's kind of flourished in his role so far. So, props to Arizona. It didn't throw me off that they've been able to perform like this, but they have surprised me in some aspects, especially being able to get the job done without shooting the three ball really at all. So they've just been dominating good competition on the interior. So that definitely props to Arizona so far.
Yeah, I've been very impressed with both Arizona and Bama. I mean, Marcus, you talked about Bama's schedule, and they have another tough opponent tomorrow with Gonzaga. But we're going to transition here a little bit. What are some other takeaways, maybe some players to watch or players that stood out to you, and some teams that are overperforming, underperforming? Marcus, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, one team, of course, that stood out this week, and it was more about, has nothing to do with really what we think about this team. Obviously, they're a top team in the country, but it was more about how they did it, and that's Purdue. The way that they completely just dismantled Texas Tech, right? I mean, this game was never really close. 23-point game at halftime, won by 30. Purdue just had their way. Shot 59% from the floor. It really showed just the dominance of this experienced Purdue offense with Braden Smith and Trey Kaufman-Renn. I mean, they had 7 guys in double figures, right? And nobody even played over 30 minutes. So, this was just an epic dominant performance against the Texas Tech team that we've been pretty high on, and they just completely dismantled them. As I said, this is really impressive win and just further solidifies our thoughts, at least for me, on what Purdue can be. And that's, of course, a national title contender.
Cody, what about you? What are other moments this week that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I have a few things, but I mean, Purdue, obviously, they looked awesome. To beat a Texas Tech team by 30 that we really like is a super impressive effort. And that's with Trey Kaufman-Renn being in foul trouble essentially the entire game. So props to Purdue. We know what they are. We knew what they were coming into the season. That was a national championship contender. But the defensive performance against Texas Tech, holding them to 56 points, is pretty impressive. And that's the one side of the ball that we really need to see them perform in order to call them a surefire tier 1 contender. And, I think they proved a lot of people wrong the other night. But I have a couple things, just some shout outs to a few mid-major teams. And I know that Marcus and I were up late watching one of these games, but it's the Troy Trojans, and what they were able to do this week was rather impressive. They were coming off losses to, I believe, CSUN, and I don't have the other team in front of me.
Loyola Marymount.
And yeah. Honestly, solid teams, nothing to scoff at. And those were, obviously losing those games and then bouncing back to do what they did this past week was extremely impressive. It started with a double overtime win over San Diego State, and then carried over, and then had to play 3 more overtimes against USC, and they lost on a heartbreaking buzzer beater from, I think it was Jordan Marsh, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just,
that shot didn't deserve to go in.
No, we were pretty devastated by that, honestly, watching that game at 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. But an awesome week for Troy. I thought there were 3 guys that really stood out on that roster. Victor Valdez, Thomas Dowd, and Cooper Campbell were all awesome in those 2 games. Thomas Dowd played 97 minutes between the 2 games, and he averaged 23 points and 15.5 rebounds. Cooper Campbell had a near triple-double against USC in the 3 overtime game, and realistically, he looked like the best guard on the floor. He had 32, 12, and 8 assists. And Victor Valdez was awesome in both games until until he fouled out of both of them. He scored 24 and 20 and was like the real like offensive hub as like that wing forward, whatever you want to call him. But he looked very good as an initiator and as a scorer. And I just thought they looked like the more composed team. And I thought they were getting better shots, particularly in the overtime game. Like if you switch the team's jerseys and you were asked like who looks like the better basketball team right now, I would have said that Troy looked like the better basketball team throughout both of those games in terms of what quality of shots that they were getting. And then one other mid-major that I want to shout out is Central Connecticut from the NEC. You know, 2 big wins over Power 5 teams. I know these Power 5 teams are more towards the bottom of these ranks, but
More
you know,
towards the
they were
bottom.
able to beat. Yeah, I mean they're down there. I'll tell you that. But wins over BC and Rutgers and holding them both under 60 points is pretty impressive. And you know, this Pat Sellers defense looks awesome again this season. They're 116th in Ken Palm's adjusted defensive rating this season, after finishing 81st last season, which that's extremely impressive for an NEC team or just a low major team in general. So props to what Central Connecticut's been able to do. Then just a couple others I'll rattle off here. Murray State's looked awesome so far this season. Liberty looks like they're humming again. You know, they have a lot of guys back and, you know, look like they're ready to win Conference USA by a few games. And then St. Louis has been awesome in the A10. I think that team has real potential to break away in that league. And, you know, Robbie Avila is still hanging around for them, and he looks great. And, yeah, they've been great so far. And then Akron in the MAC has looked really good so far. They broke away from some solid mid-majors. So they're a team to watch as well. But besides that, just one other thought. I'm just a little bit worried about the Mountain West right now. And, you know, nobody in this league really looks safe right now. Like even San Diego State, obviously, who just lost to Troy, but they just don't really have that many great wins. Like they only have 3 great wins so far. Like Utah State over VCU, UNLV over Memphis, and New Mexico over Mississippi State this past weekend are really the only big wins that this league has. And they all have blemishes as well. Like, you know, obviously Boise's loss against Hawaii Pacific doesn't really count, but it's not a great look. But there are some teams this week that need to have big performances in these MTEs, including San Diego State, they at least need 1 win at the Players Era. You know, they play a couple of good teams. Boise needs to do well at Maui, and Colorado State also needs to do well to battle for Atlantis. They're coming off a loss to Denver. So like every team in this league really has a blemish, and I'm kind of afraid that this is a 2-bid league at the best right now. And if everything goes poorly, I think it could actually turn into a 1-bid league.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up question for you, Cody, and Marcus, you can chime in as well. But with the Mountain West, could you see them maybe not having enough non-conference wins, like valuable wins, and then it's kind of a conference where the teams like to beat up on each other a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
So is that kind of your concern going forward, and just like that's how they'd only get 1 bid, basically?
Yeah, they haven't really done enough work in the non-conference. Like I mentioned, like they all have blemishes at this point in time. Like, you know, I guess one that like UNLV had a big win at Memphis, but they've also lost 2 bye games, lost to UT Martin. UT Martin's another mid-major that I didn't mention. They've been awesome. They've hung around in pretty much every game they've played and, you know, beat Bradley and UNLV. But yeah, there's just too many blemishes in this league, and they need to pick up some big wins this week, like I mentioned, if they're going to be able to be the 3 or 4 bid league that they normally have been. But the talent across the league does look a little bit down right now.
Yeah, I love seeing the success of the mid-majors, so I'm glad you got to shout them out. But we're going to transition.
Hold on. Before we move on, I think we should maybe relegate a few of these teams in the power conferences to mid-majors.
Yeah, you think so. List a few that you got on your
mind. I mean,
mind.
we've talked about, right, like I know we just kind of talked about Rutgers and BC. Yeah. Both of those teams, like they can't score 50 points. Like BC put up 49 on Davidson over the weekend. It's just a real struggle for both of those teams. Unfortunately, like this BC team a couple of years ago was fun to watch, as we've talked about, and you know it's a far cry from what that was. You know, with Quentin Post and Claudel Harris and Jaden Zachary and all those guys. That was a fun team. Now it's just kind of it's ugly.
Yeah, maybe the A10 needs to get even bigger.
Yeah, we can relegate a few A10 teams too. Put them somewhere else.
Yeah, to the NEC maybe.
That's not a bad spot for him.
Yeah.
But we're gonna transition to the panic meter now, and just how, kind of explain how panicked these fans of these teams should be. Marcus, we're gonna start with you. Oklahoma. How's the panic meter for Oklahoma early on in the season?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the panic meter is pretty high for Oklahoma. They haven't looked fantastic, obviously. The two games that they've played against power conference teams were Gonzaga, or Gonzaga's not even power conference, but they are in my eyes. Like, the relevant teams, Gonzaga and Nebraska, and they got handled by Gonzaga. Lost by 15, but in my eyes, like, that game was never that close. It never was in question. And then they lost to Nebraska, by 6 and gave up 105. We talked about, this team has real issues, particularly like on the defensive end. I just don't really see how this team's really going to be able to compete with the top of the SEC, or even like the middle of the pack of the SEC. Like, I was a little bit higher on them coming into the season. But, like, Darian Reed hasn't really broken out exactly how I thought he might in his second year coming over from Alabama. It just hasn't been pretty. And the front court, of course, as we've touched on, is an issue still. So for me, like, this Oklahoma team should be a fan base that's pretty panicked, I think.
Cody, what are your thoughts on Oklahoma so far this season?
Yeah, I would be in agreement that I think the panic meter should be fairly high. If you wanted me to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say 8.5 out of 10. But it's just because of the defense. It's been in a really bad spot so far. They're among the worst Power 5 defenses in the country. They sit at 140th in adjusted defense in KenPom, and that's a pretty rough Power 5 defense. There's not many that end up down that far, but it's just the front court concerns that we had are kind of coming to fruition right now. And Waggy's been able to stay on the floor for a relatively decent amount of time. Like, he's played 57% of the team's minutes, but they just don't really have a backup option when he goes to the bench. Like, Kai Rogers has only played 10% of the minutes so far, and they bring in like a thinner guy in Cool Atak that tries to come in and play like those spot minutes at the 5, but it kind of takes away from their rim protection. And when your backcourt defense is composed of Xavier Brown, Nigel Pack, and Dayton Forsyth, you're a little bit small in the backcourt as well. So you're kind of relying on your wings to do a few too many things. Like, obviously, I think I kind of like the group that they have on the wing, and Darian Reed, Wonkwo, and they're finally getting Jadon Jones back, which I think he's a very important piece in that aspect, but he's not providing like stable rim protection. And then another guy like Tay Davis, obviously, I'm not super high on as a defender. So I do think it's just a roster issue, and I wish Porter Moser would have tried to stack up on a few extra front court pieces just in case, like guys like Kai Rogers and Atak and Waggy's not able to stay on the floor for a large amount of games. So yeah, I think the panic meter is pretty high. The offense is really good, but I'm just not completely sure if their defense is going to be able to hold up for a whole season in the SEC.
Yeah, we're moving to the Big 12 with this next team. Cody, I'll have you start with this one, but Kansas. How panicked should Kansas fans be? I mean, they've got their best player out for the past couple games. Looks like he's going to miss maybe a couple games more, but how panicked should Kansas fans be?
Yeah, Peterson's going to be out for the Players era too. They announced that the other day. So, I mean, I think for the immediate future, I would be fairly panicked just because I don't know if the offense can really pick up the slack. Like, they've had issues with who's going to be the second option really for the entire season, and now that second option needs to slide up into being the main option. So I think Peterson is very important for that aspect. Obviously, he was an important player regardless, but when he's on a team that has questions, who's going to be that second scorer, I think it brings up even more issues. But I guess from a national relevance concern or like a championship, like if this team wants to win a championship, I would be fairly panicked. But I do think once Peterson comes back, I think this is going to be at least a stable offense. Like I think it's an offense that can finish within like the top 35 to 40 in the nation. And I'm still very high on the defense. So I do think they can compete in the Big 12 and like maybe be in that fourth or fifth range in the conference, maybe slide up into the top three if they reach their ceiling. But I guess from a national relevance concern, I'd be pretty panicked, maybe like a 7.5 or an 8. But I do think this is a team that's going to be able to pick up some big wins just because their defense is great. And when Darren Peterson comes back, I think the offense is going to be fine.
Marcus, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say pretty low on the panic meter, honestly. Like, obviously, with Darren Peterson out, things are going to look different, especially with the roster that they have, and the lack of on-ball talent without him. But, like, they're going to get Peterson back soon, and he's going to lead their offense just fine. The defense is fine. There hasn't been enough of a sample size with Peterson up to this point to like say that, you're super worried. So like, to me, it hasn't been long enough. Like their only true test when Peterson was playing was against UNC on the road, his first true road game in a hostile environment, whiteout at UNC. Like that's a tough place to go play. So once he's back, like if things still are a bit of a struggle against top teams, then I think the panic meter is a little bit high. But for now, until he's back, I think the panic meter is just kind of off right now, just with Peterson out. Once he's back, if things, if they struggle against, some of the teams that typically Kansas teams would beat, then I think you may want to sound the alarms a little bit more. But for now, I view it kind of a little bit lower, just because the defense is so good. And, I perceive the offense will be fine with Peterson back in the lineup.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving along to Mississippi State, another SEC school. Marcus, how panicked are you about Mississippi?
I'm actually going to send this one to Cody. I'm going to let him, because I know he's been very passionate about this one. So I'm gonna let him kind of kick it off and give his thoughts on Mississippi State.
All right, Cody, let's hear it.
I mean, considering I had like concerns on both ends of the floor coming into the season, and they're both coming to fruition, and even more so than I ever really imagined, I would say it's a 10. I'll put it at a 10 on the panic meter. I'm very concerned about Mississippi State's outlook this year. Like, just even competing in the SEC, they've really struggled on both ends of the floor. Like a Chris Jan's defense to be 96th in KenPom after his defensive finishes so far have been 9th, 22nd, and 46th last season. I'm pretty concerned. And it's for a Chris Jan's coach team that's typically they're typically based off of how efficient their defense is, and it's just been in a really rough spot so far. There have been a lot of pieces that he took a chance on that haven't hit, and it doesn't look like they're going to hit throughout the course of the entire season. Like the main guy being a chore for me. Like he was supposed to kind of slide into more of that Cam Matthews role on the offensive end, but he has been extremely inefficient, and it just looks like he's a little bit behind from an athleticism standpoint. I think the athleticism of power conference teams is kind of bothering him to start the year. So I don't know how much of an impact he can really be. And then, Jaden Epps has been solid, but it just doesn't seem like the fit between him and Hubbard is really it's not really going to mesh that well. They've both been good individually, and then it's just some of the other pieces that have really struggled to contribute on the offensive end. Really, like the off-ball shooting has been pretty rough so far. So yeah, I'm fairly concerned on both ends of the floor, and I would consider this Mississippi State team probably one of the worst teams in the SEC. They're probably bottom 3 or 4 right now.
Marcus, are you as panicked as Cody, or what are your thoughts on this team?
Yeah, they're not good. I panic as well. Like, Cody, we were on Mississippi State the other night against Kansas State, and boy, they could not stop these guys to save their life. I mean, 14 threes they gave up, 51% from the field. If this is going to be their defense, which I perceive it will be, just based on personnel, it's going to be a really long season for Mississippi State. It's going to be a long SEC schedule. They're not even in the conference play yet. So, I'd be very concerned. Then they followed that up the next day with, a loss to New Mexico. We'll see if they can handle New Orleans on Monday. I'd like to think so, but then again, maybe New Orleans will hang an 80 spot on them. So, I'm pretty worried.
Yeah, if we're nervous about New Orleans, then I guess the panic meter's pretty high with Mississippi State. But
hey, they beat TCU, so who knows?
They did, yeah. They have a good win under their belt for them, anyways. But one last team for the panic meter, Texas Tech. Cody, I know this is one of your kind of teams you're usually high on, so I'm going to let you take this one. How panicked are you?
I mean,
Texas Tech.
I'm sort of panicked, but I don't think I'm as panicked as the general public is after watching that just dismantling that they went through against Purdue. Obviously losing by 30 to anybody isn't really a good look, but they looked sort of lost on both ends of the floor. I think once they got down 20, I don't know if they didn't give up. Obviously, it's just they just felt kind of lost throughout this entire game. But I guess the area that I'm more concerned about is the defensive side. They've really struggled so far. Some teams have really had their way against them. Obviously, you're playing against two of the best offenses in the country when you play against Purdue and Illinois, but they were able to just kind of get whatever they wanted throughout both games. And I think it's more of a personnel issue because Grant McCasland is typically an awesome defensive coach, but the roster right now, they just seem like a little bit small. When they have to play JT Toppin at the 5 and Lawan Watts at the 4, you're a little bit thin in the front court. And when that matches with not so great point of attack defense with guys like Christian Anderson, like Tyree Bryan, Donovan Atwell, they just seem like they're getting beat off the bounce a little bit too often for, kind of a drop coverage based defense this year. I think they've kind of played a bit differently than past McCasland defenses, but I think they have to mask for some personnel issues. So ultimately on a national scale, if this team can win a national championship, I would say I'm a little bit worried, but this is a team that's going to have a high floor because the offense is going to be just fine. I still view them as a top 7 to 10 offense in the entire country. Obviously that performance is going to concern some people, but it's actually the defensive side that I'm a little bit more worried about right now.
And Marcus, I'll send it over to you. How panicked are you about Texas Tech?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, in terms of winning a national title, I'm pretty panicked. I don't really see it with the way they're playing. I think the biggest thing for me is the point of attack defense. You mentioned names like Donovan Atwell and Tyree Bryan in particular. When you're relying on those guys to be defensive stoppers on the perimeter, especially against the best teams in the country, to me, that's kind of a problem. So I have my issues with this team. I think they're going to be really good. JT Toppin's obviously he's going to be the reason why they win a lot of games. I think the panic meter needs to be hit a little bit. I'd say on a scale of out of 10, probably about a 7 in terms of, just their overall ability to kind of compete with the tops in the nation. They're still going to be a really good team though, right? They're going to have a great season. I'm not going to say that this Purdue loss is their season's over. That they still have a chance to be really good. And, they have one of the best players in the country in JT Toppin. And, obviously Christian Anderson has been really good here in his sophomore season as well. So, we'll see what they have to bounce back again. They also play New Orleans this week. on Wednesday. So everybody's playing New Orleans.
Yeah, New Orleans has a tough
New
schedule.
Orleans, they have a gauntlet, huh?
Yeah, they kind of do. But that sums up week 3. Looking ahead now, Feast Week. How do we feel about Feast Week? Cody, we'll hear your initial thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the second best week of the year for me. I think outside of, opening day of March Madness, I would say this is, or just that entire weekend, I would say this is probably the best time of the year. There are just so many great tournaments. Obviously, like the Maui Invitational and like the Battle for Atlantis have been like watered down by the Players Era tournament now. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of great teams there, but I would just like for it to be just tournaments that are more like actual like tournament style. Like in this tournament, there's 18 teams that play 2 games, and then the teams that have that go 2-0 and have the best point differential end up being the teams that play in the championship. Like I would personally like more like 8 to like more 18 tournaments that actually determine like a true champion. Like a couple of these games, like on Tuesday, are going to be determined by who blows out their second opponent, which I don't necessarily love, but ultimately it's going to be awesome to watch. There's a ton of good teams in that Players Era tournament, and some great games, like obviously headlined by Gonzaga, Alabama on Monday, St. John's, Iowa State on Monday, Tuesday, like Houston, Tennessee, and then obviously great games throughout, and whatever we get in the championship game, I'm sure is going to be awesome. But I mean, I'm going to be watching a lot of these other tournaments as well, as particularly the Maui and Battle for Atlantis. Regardless of what teams are in the tournament, it's still going to be super fun to watch. The atmosphere is always awesome there, so I'm excited for the entire week in general.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I feel like this is the start of my college basketball season traditionally. Like this is where I really start to dial in and, kind of pay a lot of attention to it and follow the games. Yeah. But Marcus, what are your initial thoughts on Feast Week?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, much like you guys, really excited for it. But, the Players Era tournament is kind of giving like NBA Cup vibes right now, right? Yeah. Like you're going to have teams like trying to push to score the ball late in these games to blow out the other team so they can get to the final. You're competing for point differential, which I don't like. Like you said, Cody, even if they made it like a 16 team tournament and did it over, several days, throughout the week. But, they just need to, I think, tweak it a little bit. I understand like there's money in it, obviously. And, there are a lot of great teams that, you're getting to see match up. But, for the sake of like crowning a champion, like the way they're going about it just doesn't really seem great. What we've seen in Maui and Battle for Atlantis, obviously Maui has always been great, loaded with talent, but that's kind of changed a little bit now. Unfortunately, we're seeing like this Players Era tournament draw in a lot of these teams that typically would venture out to Maui. So I think we've seen a shift there. But regardless, right, we're going to get a lot of great basketball games. Really, really intrigued by a lot of these matchups, especially intrigued by that Houston, Tennessee game on Tuesday. I think that should be a really fun game, with a lot of talent on both sides. So should be fun. My Texas Longhorns are out in Maui. We'll see what happens. They don't have a bad path, at least to make it to the final, I don't think. Maybe get like NC State or USC. It's too bad Troy's not in it. Maybe we could have a real fun tournament, but no. Regardless, it'll be a great week of games.
Yeah, a lot of good basketball last week. A lot of good basketball to come. That wraps up our thoughts on week 3. As always, thank you for listening to the Mainly Hoops podcast.